Joshua, I want to begin part 2 of the discussion about the Michael Moore film. I think we talked about the sort of atmospherics of it, some of the details of it, but let's get a little bit more into the film itself. I have some sympathy for this movie. I'm not going to lie. But do you have some new, anything else that you wanted to add to sort of part 2 of the Moore movie?
Yeah. Well, in fairness, now that I've seen the whole thing, I absolutely stand by everything I said last week.
Awesome.
But there's a lot more to say too. Too. And I agree. Well, let's break it down. So first, I just want to say that I understand, at least in part, why this strikes people as intuitively true, and why a lot of people resonate with this film. The way that it deals with corporate greenwashing of the environmental movement is obvious, and I think there's a lot of people for whom that might be a breath of fresh air to have corporate greenwash called out in that way. There's also a way that it describes and narrates the reality that we are living through an extinction level event right now. And I think that also can be a breath of fresh air for people who have been sold, a bill of false goods in a way. And, the way that the film, part of its thesis that is partly true is, when it looks at some of certainly the interests of capital and says their goal isn't to save the planet, but to save this way of life. Right. That's also obviously true. Although the word "this" does a lot of work there. Let's tease that apart later. It should, I think, be obvious that you can't just switch out renewable energy for dirty energy and, keep capital running in the way that it has. And those things to me are obvious. But there's also some other things that Jeff Gibbs seems very shocked by that I think those of us who've been in the field are also obvious. Until the grid gets cleaner, the manufacture of anything requires fossil fuels, including wind turbines, solar panels do need to be replaced over time. And you need to mine minerals to create things. And that's, a terrible extractive process to do that. All of these things, I was confused about why Gibbs seems so shocked and betrayed by them at times. Obviously clean energy has a carbon footprint, but one of the problems of the film, and I'll set the table so that we can kind of have a specific discussion about it in a second. But the first thing is it doesn't define clean energy, which makes it very confusing. The film, even in the things that it's correct about, it's very sloppy. It's pretty, it conflates allies and opponents. It confuses different actors in the game, and it confuses different kinds of energy. And it makes sense that it doesn't define clean energy because the EPA has changed its own definition of clean energy 15 times in the last 10 years. And there's nefarious reasons for that. It's to create loopholes. It's to create loopholes for industry, for things like, clean coal and some of the things that the film calls out accurately, like biomass and biofuels, which we can get into in more detail later. But the landscape, just to understand some of the actors that it lifts up, here's how we understand it in my world, is that first there's gray capital and there's green capital. So gray capital is like the fossil fuel industry, blah, blah, blah. We know about them. Green capital, and there's obviously this is a Venn diagram, right? Because like Shell is involved in clean energy and whatever. Right. Green capital is a whole set of interests and corporations that are interested in expanding markets as long as they're powered by quote unquote clean energy, however they define that. And they do push what we call false solutions. They push them at the United Nations. They push them on the national level. And green capital, from our take on the left, is that it's a cynical ploy to profit off of the crisis. There's people who argue with us about that, about that there's good actors in green capital as well.
Yeah, and my usual framework for all of these things, and I realize, even though I have sympathies with the movie, but just like a baseline disagreement is I just don't, for better or for worse, and obviously there's some people like that I don't like for whatever reason, but I just generally don't filter things in that way. So I think a lot of people involved in quote unquote green capital, I think there's a market logic that's there. It's obvious that people would try to generate, market opportunities, whether it's for new technologies or financial instruments or, green investing. Like, yeah, there's a lot of money to be made and there's market there. And I actually would be willing to stipulate that like 90% of people involved in doing that as part of just like a natural market reaction that they're going to be involved in, because this is how we design the economy, probably have positive intentions. Like,
there's a lot of true believers. Which
I have no doubt about that. No, and I think that's, well, it's interesting because I actually I'll go on this tangent for like 30 seconds. I think this is like where I wind up on both sides of so many conversations, and I wish we could come to a better synthesis, because it's like on one hand, actually, clearly a lot of us really do care because so much of our discourse is so fucking moralistic and way over interested in that type of thing. But if we're going to care, then actually we should, again, it's like, be forgiving and evolving and dynamic with individuals and be ruthless with institutions. And I think that, again, that's actually one of the things that I didn't care for about the movie, which is like, I think if you want to kind of tell a skeptical, maybe not even necessarily that constructive, but just like deeply skeptical counter narrative about the dominant ecology mythologies of the day, cool. I think that's great. I think that could serve a purpose. The sort of fixation on like, you thought Bill was a good guy, but he's not. I'm just kind of like over that type of thing in general.
Yeah. We're on the same page with that. And so that landscape, we're still only just talking about industry, right? So then the movement landscape, where there's what we call the shorthand is just the big greens, right? So the large establishment environmental institutions, and
the Steyer Bloomberg ones.
Yeah, and so there's a number of them that are called out in the movie that are also, for those of us on the activist left, they're also our opponents. So these are groups like EDF, Conservation International, even groups like World Wildlife Fund, and a lot of these groups, their track records are mixed, of course, but do many of them launder the reputations of oil companies? Yeah, they do. Are a lot of them in bed with some of these ridiculous schemes and funded by corporations? Yeah, they are. And so the general revulsion that the movie has about that, or feeling like we're being betrayed by environmental groups, I can relate to that frustration. That's a real thing. However, so then there's groups like everything. There's gray areas. So there's also national environmental organizations that don't do that stuff at all. And that we can get into the specific critiques of 350, but that's a good example where the critiques are just misleveraged in the wrong direction. There's groups in the film like the Sierra.
When you say they don't do stuff like that at all, you mean just like specifically like
they don't launder the reputations of Shell Oil, and they don't take corporate money in this, but I'll contrast that with like the Sierra Club, which has more of a mixed track record, which, the Sierra Club actually now is a much better actor than it was 10 years ago, where when it was run by Carl Pope, they were taking money. They had Clorox, Sierra Club branded Clorox, these ridiculous partnerships. And they did take a lot of money from liquefied natural gas. And they were out there saying fracking is good. And they were compromised by that money. That's real. Also, though, the Sierra Club is a complex institution that has a lot of local chapters that have a bottom-up democratic structure that do incredible local work.
Okay.
And
That was my read, that Sierra Club of the big ones has the most, there's a lot of problems with it, but it also has like the most like, hey, these are just like good people in your neighborhood that are trying to do something in their locality.
It's both. They're both
Right.
a large national institution that does certain campaigns. Then there are a set of local groups that do all kinds of great stuff.
Right.
And then and both of that is their national stuff. They have lots of good national stuff. And then it's real life.
Got it. Right.
And then there's other national environmental organizations like Sunrise, which there's a whole generation of work that's completely ignored by the film. But groups like, I would put groups like Greenpeace or Rainforest Action Network in the same bucket as 350. And then the fourth kind of category that I want to get clear on, which was completely left out of the film, which I mentioned last time but didn't go into detail about, is the movement that I come out of, which is there's actually three streams of it. There's the environmental justice movement, which emerged in the 80s of people fighting point source pollution who are either people of color, working class people, Native people who are primarily fighting the fact that all of these energy systems, the consequences of them fall on the backs of poor communities. And so where the refineries are, like who actually chokes on all the exhaust from this stuff. Environmental justice movements emerged from a strong critique of capitalism to organize multiracial working class communities around the environmental impacts of all of these extractive cycles. Then, when climate change became more of a comprehensive thing, that thread evolved into what's called climate justice, which is thinking more about the global impacts and also thinking about the disparities between the global north and global south and a lot of these international agreements and things like that. Then also related to that is indigenous sovereignty movements of Native people who have been protecting their land from pipelines. And in the way the movie showed Standing Rock was particularly cynical. Let's talk about that later too. As well as the fact
we can't get every part.
Yeah, totally. I'm like, I have there's so many things to talk about.
Maybe we'll do a part 3.
Anyway, and what these groups are about is they have a very sophisticated critique of capital, much more sophisticated than what's in the film. And they're doing a lot of effective work on the local level, but they also lack power. And a lot of them lack a perspective that they're thinking about on, national level energy infrastructure. That's just not their focus. And a lot of the limitations of those groups, of which the film ignores, is it is a question of power, which is why my biggest frustration with the film is not only does it not present solutions, but it also doesn't present a path to power. And so the best way to think about the relationships between these like climate justice groups and the big greens for an audience like our audience is the way that people get frustrated at the DNC. So if you look at the corporate Democrats, those are like, they act, the way that corporate Democrats treat the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that's how a lot of these big greens treat the environmental justice movement. And similar in democratic politics, it's not that progressives are necessarily wrong, but we lack a lot of the power relationships to move our agenda. And that's also true in that relationship with these different groups. Right. And so to me, to see a film that critiques some of these big green groups, but is kind of getting the critique wrong, and then not drawing on any of that, it sort of feels like another metaphor would be the way that you talk about like new atheists who like just discovered that religion is destructive and they're like, all religion's terrible. Right, and it's religion is destructive, of course. There's a more nuanced way of looking at this. And so that was kind of my reaction to this, where it aside from the science, which we can talk about what it gets wrong, the film starts off, if we want to walk through it, with this opening scene, or it's not the opening scene, but early on, where Jeff Gibbs is like, there's no better place to see where the clean energy revolution is happening than Vermont Solar Festival. I'm like, what do you mean there's no better place? What a ridiculous place to start. Was like a random solar festival with some hippies that was like just starting. And it kind of makes a lot of sharp turns from there. So I have some other things to say, but
I just want to say specifically with regards to that. I mean, and people whatever. I don't know. I'm not going to always kind of add caveats to things. On this issue, specifically with regards to that, the best place to start is Germany. On this just very specific issue. I mean, Germany has had, I don't know the latest, but I know of a couple of years ago, they had actual days where they were producing such energy efficiency that people were actually, like Jeremy Rifkin writes about, having the capacity to basically sell their own electricity, their own energy excess back to the grid, right? That like so much was running at certain times of the day on renewables that people were actually getting a rebate, for their energy efficient appliances, as an example. So like, I know, and I don't know if I'm explaining that terribly well, but I'm just saying that like, yes, that, I don't get too lost in like, oh, the science is 10 years out of date, because honestly, I don't know what that necessarily means. I understand that there's a lot of arguments here, and I think some of which are very important and very credible. Like, yeah, if we're going to run electric cars and that's going to like help spark a coup in Bolivia, like, yes, that needs to be part of a serious, like an approach to how we're dealing with this stuff. And obviously most kind of mainstream environmental stuff doesn't factor that into account. But at the same time, and I really did feel this watching it, it was just like, yeah, this isn't a solar festival in New York. There are European countries that have definitely deployed these technologies at a pretty rapid rate, and they've made reductions in their emissions. Does that make them utopias? Does that mean that there aren't other problems? Obviously not. But they've done something with these things. And China's starting to do something with these things. And India has actually had some real success with these things. And Turkey, Turkey has an incredible amount of solar panels. And that's actually been true of Turkey for a long time. So at any rate, that's one thing. I guess.
Can I respond to one part of that before you go on? Which
Yeah.
is just that the reason the reason it matters so much, particularly when it comes to solar and wind, that the stuff is 10 years out of date is not just because that's light years in the past for these technologies and their development.
Right.
It's that the premise of the film has a baseline scientific illiteracy, which is that people who work on this, when you evaluate the emissions caused by these things, you do what's called life cycle analysis. It's a whole field of science. You don't just measure the amount of fossil fuel production required to create a solar panel.
Right.
You measure how much is saved over the course of its entire lifetime. And so where we're at with solar now, for example, like, does it cost fossil fuels and mining in order to create solar panels? Absolutely it does. That's not news. But it lasts 30 years and it is 90% pollution free when it runs over that period of time. 10 years ago, that was not the case, right? And that the fact that it doesn't offer any calculations through the whole life cycle of these things, there's no other way to explain that other than it's active deception. Like, there's no way Jeff Gibbs could know that. There's any.
Well, I don't want to say. Again, maybe this is just my like being super cautious here, but who the fuck knows? Maybe he's very lazy.
It's generous. It's
no. I'm not trying to
negligence.
Follow what I'm saying. It's not about negligence. It's not about generous. Let's just be.
I hear you.
Speculating. We don't know what's in the guy's head. And that has to be
let me rephrase. The consequence of it is deceptive.
Okay. So no, and I'm really glad you clarified that point. So, look, I think that my only ways in which I'm basically going to try to, and I think we talked about the population stuff last week. I understand how you can spin what they're saying about population into a question. And I think, frankly, the way it was, if I had to guess, at least what Michael Moore intended, which is a question about consumption and how much space we're taking up and this type of thing, which I'll get to in a second. I think that's a valid. I think that's valid. I also think it, I want to say something that's a little contradictory. One hand, I don't like to dismiss things just because bad faith actors run with them. So one of the allergies I had when this movie came out was like, oh, Breitbart's writing it up, so therefore it's bad.
Mhm.
I don't play that game anymore. I've seen people I know who do extraordinary work, and I've also seen the left at times, again, like I'll just say
You're just saying that because your book was reviewed so well by Breitbart.
Yeah, they love my Breitbart was very sympathetic to my book. Exactly. But, I think we've seen, I've seen cases of the left either, again, you can disagree with somebody's arguments, but like saying that like Angela Nagel's a Nazi versus, is like insane. Like that's actually like an insane thing to say. Or I've seen other people who, they'll take something and they'll twist it. Right-wing media is extremely adept at this, right? So that being said, I still found the population stuff. I don't want to swim in those waters. And I think the movie does swim in those waters to some extent. And you're not going to get me to budge. Obviously not you, because you don't want me to budge. But nobody is going to get me to budge on that at its base. Gets back to Victorian race science shit. It has the worst permutations of every aspect of the environmentalist movement that has either bled into nativism or devised, essentially neo-colonialist projects for the developing world, or not even factored in indigenous people one way or another into like various plans. And then of course, as a result of not factoring them in, dislodged them from their homes as an example. So I don't, so anyways, that's where I'm echoing it. But I think where I would defend it somewhat, but they would have had to go in a different direction for this to be salient. I think that there is nothing wrong with, and people need to get increasingly more comfortable with just like minority reports on things. Like the movie saying like, look, we're in a fucking disaster. Every iteration of like the environmental movement is not up for the task of meeting that disaster. Now, I totally agree with you with all that we've stipulated, which is like, it's getting some very important technical things wrong. It's conflating a lot of areas that it should disaggregate. And it's also not addressing a whole other terrain that is more interesting. But there is like a part that's like, no, it's healthy to take on that perspective that this just isn't going to work, that we are causing such enormous destruction at such a rapid rate that any kind of like sitting down in a conference room and gaming it out and talking about solar panels is just like ludicrous. Like that could go in three different directions. I think where the film goes is it just kind of leaves you with, in a way, not much. And that's why it's been taken up by the right. Or it could go in a direction that I think they should have gone in, frankly, which is it should have just been like a 70s style, like, let's talk about Small is Beautiful. Let's talk about Ivan Illich and like really make the claim that people need to try to decommodify their lives more, not in a Marxist sense, but I think where this movie's going is just like in a consumer sense. People need to learn how to live more simply. People should voluntarily, if they have the capacity to, try to live in ways where they drive less and consume less and things like that. I think that misses a lot of important parts of economic analysis and class analysis, but I think there's a validity to it. And I think that that's a line of thinking that has contributed to a lot of positive social trends, like community supported agriculture and other things that we can make fun of, and they have their limits, but they're actually really nice contributions to our culture. Or it could have gone in the let's take on capitalism direction, which, is in some ways it's like the biggest bummer for me out of all of this is I think that Michael Moore in the beginning of his career was the closest we had to a guy that could do mass cultural, like, pop propaganda for the left, who got labor unions and got basic class structure. And I'm like, where the fuck is that? And that's a bummer,
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said. And it's, my biggest frustration is not what it gets wrong, but it's that it raises the question of capital, but does not pursue it. And it's frustrating for me coming out of movements that do pursue it.
Right.
And also it's helpful for you to remind me of, the big picture of what many people might take from this is exactly what you just stated, which is like, this problem is so much bigger than like a technical quick fix. And if that's what people are taking from it, that's great. That's a great impact.
Right.
I come to it from taking all of that for granted. And to some degree, I think my frustrated reaction is a reflection of how much of a bubble I'm in, to be honest. Although I do think to circle back to what you said about the population stuff, I do think that if you raise an accurate analysis of how much trouble we're in and don't give anywhere to go, the hegemony asserts itself, and that moves in the direction of eco-fascism. Right. Because ultimately, not only does the movie not raise the question, pursue the question of capital, but in raising the way that it raises the population argument by having that montage of like 5 people just sort of state it without saying where it's going or why, it reinforces a capitalist notion of scarcity that is not true. And so right. The way that it makes assumptions about scarcity also informs the conclusions about consumption, which is, I absolutely believe that our lifestyles in the United States are going to need to change significantly. But the way that we define consumption, we can raise our standard of living significantly right. and not be consuming in the way that we are, where we're, there's only 8% of waste in this country is what goes out in your trash bags or is at construction sites. 52% right. is in the dig, dump, burn cycle of manufacturing. And that can be changed through regulation. And socialists have an answer for that. And so right. there's a lot we can do to reduce consumption that isn't about sort of an abstraction of scarcity that comes from this, which is why I think the movie, by not pursuing the question of capital, reinforces capitalism, ironically.
No, I think that's totally true.
And then also the reason that when it posits population, but doesn't actually offer it as a solution, because the United Nations, the IPCC report that came out in 2018 said that we have to cut emissions by 45% in 10 years from now, in 2030. How is what are they proposing we do that would follow a population reduction strategy in the next 10 years that would have that impact? It doesn't make any sense,
Totally. No, I totally agree. And I think that is what happens when and again, obviously I have my kind of, I'm not even really attached to a lot of the terminology here of, socialist or whatever, but, I as best I can, I find when we're talking about most political things that a Marxist framework is the most rigorous and most clarifying. And it is interesting because it's like, I totally have that bias, but it's like, I see this movie and I see popping off some interesting criticism and maybe just some good, poke in the eyes at some complacency. But if you can't follow it to, dealing with the underlying economic structure, then it's like, all right, so what are and ironically, you're kind of left with just a more sort of dispirited version of basically the same thing that everybody else is saying. It's like, yeah, well, I guess I will recycle. I'm more informed than the other people, and I know that won't really make any difference, but what the fuck else am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Or maybe I won't recycle at all. I mean, honestly, there was a moment I watched that movie, I was just like, I want to get the most gas. I don't even drive a car in New York, but I want to just get a fucking Jeep. Enjoy this last 10 years that we got.
Well, that's one of the responses that comes of just we're doomed anyway, so let's have a party, Right. And there's a couple other things that the film gets right that I want to mention. And I do want to mention a couple of the specific inaccuracies because it actually taught me about propaganda. And so if we have time, I want to just say both of those things. The first is that, so we do need to separate, and I think we've said this in the last one, but we should, just to say explicitly, the calling out of biofuels and biomass, we need to separate that from wind and solar. Those things are entirely different. And biomass has actually been campaigned against by many of the groups critiqued in this film, including Bill McKibben, who 10 years ago made a statement about supporting biomass and then was against whatever. We can.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like that.
Why?
That was no. That the way they played that, because it's like, no, the guy 10 years ago mistakenly endorsed like a college project.
Mm-hmm.
You know, essentially. And then, I mean, look, as far as I can tell, and, you know, someone could present to me if I was wrong, was basically like, yeah, there was something that I thought might be part of a solution set 10 years ago. It clearly wasn't. And I haven't supported it ever since. Again, that is exactly the type of mentality that I have just gotten so allergic to and disgusted by generally, that you would take something that somebody did as like a sincere miscalculation in the moment and then just try to like ram it up, like, beat them with it 10 years later. I think that's pretty gross.
Than that. The thing that's worse than that, though, is that since then, it was these environmental justice movements that educated Bill and said, hey, this is wrong. And then he spent the last decade advocating against biomass. I've seen him do it to huge crowds.
Yeah, I don't like that.
When he heard about this film, he, in a very sincere, earnest way, wrote them a letter and said, hey, you're getting this wrong, expecting them to be like, oh, okay, we got it wrong. That's not your position.
Yeah.
And they knew that wasn't his position and kept it in the film anyway. But one thing that I want to just say that was deeply satisfying to me in the film was the portions about Al Gore, because Al Gore is an opponent of ours. And to see him taken down a peg actually was pretty satisfying.
That?
Al Gore, for people who don't know his history, he held international negotiations around climate change hostage for years until they incorporated neoliberal market mechanisms into the Kyoto Protocol. It was called the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, which laid the foundation for a lot of failed carbon trading schemes. And those of us in the climate justice movement have been like entirely, that architecture has been one of the things that is central to what the film is, I think, trying to call out, right? And that moment when he's sitting with, Richard Branson and who's asked, is Al Gore some kind of prophet? And then he says, well, how do you spell prophet? I was like, wow, that's a good clip. And so, I wish I could remember how to do an Al Gore impression, but
give that a minute. I mean, so Al Gore, because he is still, I think, in the mainstream, I think he is still the symbol of what it means to be green, what it means to take ecology seriously. I remember reading up, there was a great book called Al Gore, A User's Manual that Alexander Coburn co-wrote in 2000. And it already went back to the base of like, even by conventional environmental standards, this guy did not have a particularly pro-environmental voting record in the Senate. His family was rich off of Occidental Petroleum. And a lot of what he was pushing for in global climate frameworks were, basically what would turn into like tree planting, carbon offsetting, and, open Mexico for Walmart sort of stuff.
Yeah. He was part of this milieu that was a lot of the same multinational corporations that in the kind of global justice era were using institutions like the IMF and World Bank as mechanisms to forward a neoliberal agenda worldwide. They recognized early on that climate is everything. It's not some niche issue about the environment. It's also healthcare. It's also immigration. That these international negotiations were an opportunity for them to write international treaty architecture for basically everything.
Right.
And the U.S. refused to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol until neoliberal mechanisms got inserted. And a lot of us for decades have been trying to fight those. And that's been the journey to what eventually became the Paris Accords of this like all of these, vulture interests circling these negotiations and trying to use them to push forward their agenda. And that's what I really wish
And Gore sits on the board of Apple, and he's got a green investment fund that is a pretty major player on Wall Street. So just, to kind of loop the thread there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, if you watched this movie and had that sort of intuitive, there's people who are taking advantage of us for corporate profit. That's true. But the other things that it gets wrong, to me, it helped me learn about propaganda when I could see it on this side. And I know you can be as careful as you want with ascribing intentions, but I just want to give a couple examples of, I'll give another one about Bill. So there is a moment that reminded me of how you talk about Lava Jato and how you talk about the role of corruption being hijacked in a right-wing direction, where, you could probably, summarize it better than I could, but that, corruption is a real issue, but if you don't understand the context of corruption that people are swimming in, you can point the fingers in the wrong direction and use it to demonize individuals who aren't actually caught up in the thing. And that's what happened to Lula. Is that, you could probably say that,
we gotta be slightly mindful of the time, but yeah, that, okay. I think that's basically right. But also that, that basically, if I get where you're going, there is a major difference between somebody like a Bill McKibben, and this is my read on who Bill McKibben is, of saying, maybe I understand that in some sense we need a complete redesign of the economy or whatever to sort of really accomplish these tasks, but I'm also going to work in the world as it is. And that might mean that, I don't know, that I don't want to ascribe anything to him that's unfair, but it's just there is a radical difference between, what you've described Al Gore is doing versus somebody going to Paris, seeing all the flaws and trying to figure out an angle where they can get the best deal possible for what they represent in good faith. And again, if somebody just says oh, well, both of you were at Paris working with these various predator interests and acquiescing to the process, that's both corrupted. Well, then it can become a really dumbed down conversation and, used.
Well, and it happens on the left when people talk about following the money. So
right.
Can we have an informed, thoughtful conversation about the role of philanthropy and nonprofits, which is complex and quite problematic? Definitely we can have that conversation. And are nonprofits flawed vehicles in a variety of structural ways, including how they get funded? Absolutely. That said, 350.org, it takes public grants, and all of their grants are sorry, I just had a brain wire cross. It's all public information. And there was an interview put on there by a person named Karen Strickland, who's kind of this sort of gotcha person who is asking Bill about if Rockefeller donates to 350. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is not a controversial donor, right? They I don't know everything that they fund, but a lot of nonprofits take money from them and do great work. And a lot of people who work for them, they're like the kids of inheritors of these oil fortunes. And they're like, oh my God, we want to do good with this money. We could have a whole conversation about them, but they're not like Shell Oil giving money to launder their reputation, right? So what the movie does is it has Karen ask Bill, well, do you still get money from Rockefeller? And then he kind of stutters and doesn't get to the question. And it's not clear to me why. But knowing kind of
maybe he just doesn't know.
Well, that's what's behind the curtain is Bill was often ignorant about funding. That wasn't his job. That wasn't his role. And he was sometimes embarrassed about that. He was sometimes embarrassed that he couldn't answer a question about the funder. Right. So what happens as an audience is that there's actually a benign question about a benign funder, and then someone responding and kind of stumbling without any real reason. But the way that it appears as the viewer, because it's the word Rockefeller, you assume that it's nefarious because you see Bill reacting kind of self-consciously. You assume he's trying to hide something. And the film doesn't need to give any analysis of who is this funder? What do they do? What are they accusing 350 of being compromised by? What are they accusing 350 of using the money for? And so as an audience member, you connect all these dots in a very manipulative way that actually is like, nah, I mean, who cares if they're funded by RBF? It's not even a thing. And if you want to go to their website and see who they're funded by, you can. And but it creates this narrative of like these shady, shadowy leaders who are deceiving you for their own agenda. And that's the thing to me that when I see that, I'm like, wow, like, the only reason I would know any of that is just because I know the inside game of some of this stuff. And I'm like, what else am I watching where I'm, it just makes me realize how effective propaganda can be. And those are the parts of the film that I think people react to emotionally. And so when folks are like, oh my God, these environmentalists getting so upset, it's like, when you see that, that's what gives me compassion for the people who get really upset about the film, where they're just like, God, I don't know how you're not lying on purpose. And there's a lot of other examples of that, but I know you said we got to end now.
I just want to echo that, because again, like Adolph Reed and people have spoken and written extremely, like, there is a problem with the role of nonprofits as a stand-in for an actual left. And that is a structural problem. And I know you and I have talked about it. And again, like, it could be as crude as reputation laundering an oil company. It could also be that even if you're dealing with really well-intentioned and nice, heirs to fortunes, that still is going to dilute,
it's totally problematic.
It's totally problematic. So again, but this just keeps kind of feeding back to the point of like, there's so many potentially and probably still really controversial and would be a pain in the ass for people, smart and constructive documentaries that they just didn't end up making.
Right.
And I think that's my last thought on it. And I think that is a shame.
And that's why I brought up the Lava Jato thing, which is like,
right.
Is corruption in Brazil problematic? Yeah. And is it part of the landscape? And you have to figure out how to relate to that. And is it public and in the open? Yeah. Let's have a real conversation. The conclusion that these people are, shadowy and deceptive is just not it. And so to me, it's like, I agree with everything you said that could be valuable about the film. It still is hard for me to see this film and not see Gibbs as someone who was just like, I used to think clean energy was perfect, and then I found out it wasn't perfect, so therefore it's useless.
I totally know. A lot of them, no, the movie has the real vibe of somebody who probably more naively than most bought into some stuff and is now like a jilted lover. I mean, totally. And I agree. And that's just not, so yeah. And whatever. I mean, I've said, part of the reason I wanted to put some defenses is I think that there's, I think there is a couple of moments and some things with some value in it. And I think it is, I've already explained the things that I've gotten allergic to and the reaction to it. But, at the end of the day, like I don't, especially if you're making a movie, this isn't a piece of art. I'm all for defending the idea that not all art or comedy or whatever needs to be politicized. And I love Michael Jordan, and I don't care that he wasn't political. And comedy can be funny if it's, not political or has bad politics or whatever. Like I'm so over those conversations. But in this case, you made a documentary about the global environmental movement, whose practical upshot does seem to be people tuning out from constructive action. So, look, at the end of the day, the performance is not good. So I feel you. Joshua.
Yeah. Can I ask you one more question?
Please.
The last random thought I want to share. Is just that the end of the movie is weird. It is this footage of orangutans burning in a way that is heart-wrenching, but it's also about, that footage is related to palm oil plantations in a way that the film doesn't even discuss. So
Right.
it's and in the way that a lot of the groups in the film actually are doing really good campaigning on palm oil. And so it was just totally weird. It was, and that just felt like, heartstrings with no connection to anything. And feel free to answer this question or not, but I'm curious about your take on why you think, we've talked a little bit about the defensive response from environmental people. And we've also talked about why people sort of rightly feel like they like the movie, but I'm also, there's a huge number of people who are angrily defending the movie and are angrily going, and I'm wondering what you think that's about.
I think it's very trendy right now I think a lot of people, there's a very big market for, you compared it to the DNC earlier. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like there was this cluster of people in my mind. And funnily enough, I think Michael Moore is actually somebody who's been pretty guilty of this as a public figure. Like, he's a guy who has had some really good politics and, I think has done some really good stuff, but like, he was somebody who would sort of like, I love Bernie Sanders, but I also love Hillary Clinton. I love, I sort of, and I guess I think there was maybe some people who weren't as tuned into politics or the particulars of these organizations and people. And now instead of realizing, either the market forces behind these things or some of the, more complexities, they've just sort of turned a generic, like, I used to think Bill McKibben's a good guy. Now I know he's a bad guy.
Yeah.
And I think there's some element of that. And again, and that's a flaw of the movie. The movie does not push for a rethink or a sophisticated analysis. It kind of pushes for, here is the latest group of people that have scammed you.
Right. Which reinforces these false binaries that like clean versus dirty energy is a false binary. These movement leaders being heroes or villains is a false binary. There's a lot of villains.
I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And I think that, but again, I also see them, at least some of the threads that I've seen of people who have been so reactive against the film and then watching people, respond to them, they seem very reciprocal together. But again, I don't think social media helps people think clearly. Mm-hmm. I don't think, I think it speaks to a very clear need right now for simplistic, heroes and villains. And I think right now it's very appealing to people. They're almost like discovering a new market. And in some ways it's really good, but it's like, oh, for years I've understood that like the Republicans and the Koch brothers, whatever, that I know all these people are fucking monsters, but now I'm understanding that the Democrats are fucking, and you know what, they are, right? I mean, that is, again, there is some truth to that, but it isn't getting turned into a structural analysis. It's getting turned into another, kind of fantasy world of heroes and villains and different personalities that are either good or bad. And that is ultimately like, what really sours me on the movie is that it's just like, it brings
the
up
Jimmy
these
Dorification of that's and that in the same way that
that's exactly what it is. Including, by the way, again, I've tried to be more nuanced. I've tried to be like, wait a second, let me tap into the rage he's speaking to a little bit more, because again, it's like one of these things where it's like, the specifics he's getting wrong or whatever is just like not the point. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, that's it. It's being radical is screaming, and basically everything is fucked. And the kind of only thing that really is there is to just scream into different social media voids. And again, that's obviously the upshot of that is functionally reactionary. Now, conversely, and this really is the last thing I'll say, at the same time, I see so many people doing this false fake positivity, like, oh, COVID is totally consolidating neoliberalism and Bernie lost, and all of these governments around the world get more and more, grotesque, and wealth is concentrating and ecology is collapsing. But man, I feel so excited today to be in, fill in the blank activist group, and there's so many opportunities for us. And it's like, No. Right? Like, how do you present to in this real way that, like, of course there's possibility. Of course human beings are amazing and adaptable. Of course there's opportunities for us. But also, like, things are incredibly fucking bad. And a lot of venues are closed. And, you know, at the very least, we need to try to engage in some clear thinking. But I actually think that's the dysfunctional dialectic I see. I see, like, every year you're a fucking sellout and fuck, you know, which I think you're right. This movie kind of broadly fits into. And then I also see, like, you know, we just got to keep going. We got, you know, the squad, and they've completely redefined. And it's like, no, they haven't. Stop bullshitting. It's not that
dysfunctional dialectics is a good band name.
That's what, dysfunctional dialectic. Yeah. All right. Well, speaking of which, let's talk about it. What do we got? That's a good transition.
I was trying to help you out there.
Thank you, brother. I didn't realize how much I had to communicate there until you brought it out of me.
Yeah. Well, and it is the naming of Door, I think, helped me realize why I got pissed off last week. It hits that same thing where it's like, oh, I just want to do this right.
Totally. And I got to tell you, like, I stand by most of my criticisms of the guy, but I have more, not sympathy for, you know, like, I don't even watch the show, but I think that the anger that is speaking to, you know, especially right now as circumstances have changed, like in 2016, for people to not say we are decades behind and we opened up some doors here and it's fucked up and it's disgusting and the Clintons are disgusting and the whole game is disgusting, but maybe there's a little bit of a lane here. Now I have to say, on the other side of 2020, when I hear people say, well, you just got to keep pushing, and, you know, who knows? I had the same contempt for them that I had for Door in 2016, because I'm like, this is just fucking delusional. Totally. And that's my watchword. As soon as I decide something is delusional, that's when I'm like, and I think they're both, you know, again, sitting in toxic reaction to things with no kind of constructive agenda is absolutely not the place to go. But I think people are really reacting to a lot of fake enforced positivity, which is also total bullshit. So.
God, I have so much more to say, but
we'll do it. We'll do it. Come on, brother. We got a million things to do together. We know that.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.